Welcome back, everybody, to the Music Cities podcast. Today, we're going to explore something a little different. We're still going to think about how music connects people to place. But today's episode is going to be called The Sounds of Service, or maybe The Soundtrack of Service. And it's about sort of that emotional connection we have with music, and how that translates into an emotional connection to a place, and how over time, different types of situations connect us to places in very different ways. And maybe those connections fade, maybe those connections represent a certain time in our life. And especially if you've been in the military, your different experiences, there's a soundtrack to those experiences. And it can have a profound effect on how you relate with certain places. And then as we go through this, what I want to think about is, are there lessons we can extract from that are relevant to helping our cities and our neighborhoods and our downtowns? What can we learn from that military connection between music and place that we can use when we're trying to implement, that we can use when we're trying to make great places and places that people want to be? And maybe it will also help us understand why maybe people don't want to be in a place, and what role can music play in that, or at least understanding the character of a place. And I thought about this because there was a post on LinkedIn not too long ago where someone was talking about, asking veterans, what are the songs, what's the music that you use, that you listen to deal with certain situations, to deal with stress, for example. And, I had my answers, but, it got me thinking about this. And, there's a lot of podcasts and there's a lot of conversation about using music as therapy, whether it's for PTSD, whether it's for stress, whether it's just getting through the day, whether it's for recovery. And that's important, and there's a lot of venues for that. That's not exactly what I see here. This is sticking with the Music Cities theme. How do we look at music and how it connects to a place, but do that through the lens of veterans? And what I envision here is making this something that we come back and visit every few episodes, and use this as an opportunity to bring other veterans on and hear their stories about music, service, and those places that they served, and how they relate to those places in a good or a bad way through music. But to get started, I'll just talk a little bit about my experience and tell you some of those stories and some of my experience with music as I went through the service. I joined the Army in 1988, having spent most of my high school years and my first 2 years of college that I had done playing music, playing in bands, playing in a high school band that was a cover band of mainly 80s hard rock, hair metal. And then when we broke up, joining a top 40 band there in my hometown in Canyon, Texas, when I was doing my first 2 years of college. And I had a great experience doing that. We played some gigs. I would hang out at the music store, and I was able to meet some people, and I was able to sit in and learn from some really good musicians there around Amarillo, Texas, and the scene there. But then that got interrupted. Any dreams, hopes that I had of maybe making music a career, that pathway got interrupted whenever I joined the Army. And when I was in the Army, I went to basic training in Fort Dix, New Jersey, in the summer of '88. And from there, I went to the Defense Language Institute. I don't remember there being a soundtrack to basic training. What I do remember is there's a music element in war movies. And there's especially a music element in Vietnam War era war movies, or movies about Vietnam. And the directors of those movies went to extra lengths to really incorporate a soundtrack that creates the emotion and the feel of those wars, whether it was Apocalypse Now or Platoon or Full Metal Jacket. It just so happened Full Metal Jacket had just come out and was playing at the base theater at Fort Dix when I was in basic training, and we were taken to see it. That's probably the only place that I really heard music during basic training. We didn't have Walkmans. We'd count cadence, sing cadence in our formations, but it was really, I hadn't thought about it. It was really probably the only 2 months out of my life that really went without music being a part of it. But from basic training, I moved on to Monterey, California, to the Presidio of Monterey. And there, your musical taste, it's not that they change, but you get exposed to maybe some different new music. My interest had always been hard rock and heavy metal. A little bit of country, especially more of the outlaw country like Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, and classical. I'd started listening to classical in high school, and I think it was just part of the guitar, and people like Yngwie Malmsteen, and that neoclassical type of guitar got me listening to some of those classical pieces, and really got an appreciation of it. But then when you're around all these people that have different musical tastes, some of them might rub off, but it's still going to be, I think, what you connect with. And I can remember being early in the barracks when I got sent to Monterey, and my roommate for the first couple of weeks, I can't remember what his name is, but I remember that he was of Czech descent. And as we were talking, he was also a big classical music fan. And while I had listened to a lot of classical music, I wasn't an expert at it. I wasn't a big connoisseur. I had what I liked, and I listened to that, and I didn't really explore a lot of other things. I liked Bach. I liked the very guitar-y things that adapted to the guitar very well, and Bach is one of those. And then some themes that are very easy to play, or that adapt, things like the William Tell Overture, Mozart's 40th Symphony. But he introduced me to Dvořák, the Czech composer, and the piece The New World. And I just found the sounds of it fascinating. And I listened and listened and listened to it over and over and over. And still to this day, when I hear that piece come on, I'm back in that barracks room talking about girls with him while we're listening to that symphony. I think it was that influence that led me to further explore things like Tchaikovsky and eventually Prokofiev, and more of that style and that geographic base of classical music. But then we moved into our barracks, and it just so happened that I had a roommate. Me being from Texas, it just so happened that I got paired up with a gentleman, Brett, partner in crime the whole time we were out there, and some time in Texas. And me being from Texas, and he was from Great Falls, Montana, I think we hit it off very well. Very similar backgrounds, very similar cultural originations, came from very similar family type environments, much more into country music than I was, even though I didn't have anything. Much more into country music than I was. His preference was Hank Williams Jr., and I had listened to some Hank Jr. I was very much more of the Texas base, like Waylon, who was from not far from where I grew up, and Willie. But the Hank Jr., once I gave it a chance, I really got into it, and I really, wanted to learn everything about it and immerse myself in it, because, there's more of an edge there. You think, you hear the word outlaw, and but Hank Jr. had that rock and roll element to it, and especially if you saw his live shows, and he was voted Entertainer of the Year numerous times back in there. There was that rock and roll element to it. Hearing him cover things like LaGrange by ZZ Top, and what I realized was, that I could really appreciate that type of music, and it was just something that fit the soundtrack of being in the Army and being at the language school at the time. And so again, when I think about Hank Jr., when I hear Hank Jr., it connects me back to those places. And it was very fitting because Hank Jr., a lot of his songs, there's a party element to his stuff. There's a rock and roll element. There's a party element. There's a fun, go out and have fun. There's a humorous side to a lot of what he did. And that kind of worked really well at the language school at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, because it was a campus environment, and it was almost a collegiate type of experience. Just the sort of lifestyle we had with class, obviously still with all of our Army stuff we had to do, but a barracks building that was mostly full of girls, lots of drinking, lots of going out and having fun when we weren't meeting our obligations with class in the Army. And so it's just, there's a very nostalgic element to Hank Jr. when I hear it still, and if I want to feel that, if I want to feel the bonfires on the beach out close to Fort Ord with that group of people, there's specific songs I can go to from Hank Jr. That make that up. Now at the same time, I couldn't listen to only country and only Hank Jr. I had to have my rock and roll. And the other music that takes me back to Monterey is Meatloaf. And I had this big '84 Caprice Classic, and I'd drive it around, and it was one of the few soldiers that had a car. And of course, all of the girls wanted to hang out with somebody that had a car. And I can remember especially driving around Monterey, and between Monterey and Salinas and San Francisco, and Meatloaf, Bat Out of Hell, was the soundtrack to that. And so again, there's a very nostalgic element when I listen to that, of not just the people that I was with when doing that, but specifically to that time and that place, and just this emotional connection to Northern California whenever I listen to Meatloaf. But still, we're in training, we're in school, we're not out, doing what we eventually would be doing, being in the Army. From there, moved to Goodfellow Air Force Base for the Army's intelligence training at the school there, and that was sort of more of the same. It was especially more of the Hank Jr. It was sort of the same group of people. We were back in Texas in my element, so there was more of the Texas piece. But this is where it became live much more. This is where you had some new country artists. Country was starting to become more popular. So I can remember there was a bar, a big honky tonk there called the Santa Fe Junction in San Angelo, Texas. And we'd go there a lot because it was probably pretty close to the base. It didn't take us a lot to get there. And so we'd go there a lot. We'd go there for happy hour. They would have live music there. Remember, I think it was Shania Twain playing there before she had made it big. Clint Black playing there before he made it big. But it was around that time, Garth Brooks was starting to come up. So that generation of country was going, and and it really was picking up during that time that we were in San Angelo. And so again, it was very fitting, but there was a lot of that type of live country music going on. And besides the Santa Fe Junction, there were a couple of other places where we could go, especially at happy hour or even late at night, and experience that and get that live music vibe, to kind of take the edge off after we got out of our intelligence training classes during the week. From there came Panama. And I remember, in Panama, I have a guitar at the house that I took with me. I hadn't really, my time in Monterey, the one thing that was missing, and even my time, I would say, in San Angelo, I didn't have my guitar with me. I still had my guitars at my parents' house in Canyon, Texas, which was about a 5-hour drive from San Angelo. And I'd drive up there now and then, and maybe tinker around a little bit, but I hadn't really played. And I remember, actually, I was on a layover here in Miami on my way to Panama, and I had a long layover, and I got a taxi, and I went to a pawn shop in Hialeah, and I bought this just really Frankenstein guitar. I think it's got a banana neck, it's got a Fender body, it had aftermarket pickups in it, but I had that in a small amp. Actually, it's a small amp that's over here. The time that I was down there. And so it gave us something that I could just come out and play at the gazebo at the Bohio in front of the barracks when we were off duty. But one thing, I don't know how I ended up with it. When I got to Panama, my roommate Jack was also a Texan. He was the only other Texan in the unit, and we happened to end up in the same barracks room, and we listened to the same music. Lots of Hank Williams Jr. He was Texan too. Lots of Jerry Jeff Walker, David Allan Coe, and then getting more into some of the rock and roll as well. But I remember going to the Post Exchange and making on, I think in Coruscant, and making it beeline all the way to the back of the PX where the cassette tapes were, and digging through and looking for Hank Jr. Especially, but music by anybody that we were looking for, because Armed Forces Radio was not playing what we wanted to listen to. Side note, maybe one thing we'll talk about in one of the follow-up episodes here is the incident where Manuel Noriega fled into the Vatican embassy in Panama City, and the Army surrounded the Vatican embassy with loudspeakers, and the Southern Command Network radio started taking requests of music to blast at the embassy. Maybe so one of these other episodes we'll dig into that. I have the playlist throughout those days of what they blasted. Anyway, but Panamanian radio was not playing what we wanted to hear, and so it was always digging for these tapes at the PX so that we'd have something familiar and something that connected us to it. But because music is something that got us through, I can remember Sergeant Bancroft down the hall from us, always put his big multi-piece stereo and taking it out for the 2 or 3 days we'd be hanging out at the Bohio between, when we got off shift until our next shift started. So music was kind of always there. It was not a place for live music. It was an NCO club, and they'd have a country night, I can remember. But at some point, when I was in Panama, I ended up with a CD, and I don't know how I got it. I don't remember buying it. I remember that it sat in my collection for a long time, and I gave it maybe a couple of tries, listens here or there, but I just sat there, and finally I let it play. And I thought, what is this? This is kind of cool. And I was late coming to this genre to Hillman. We did an episode on Hillman, episode 3, but it was Feeding Frenzy, a live album by Jimmy Buffett that had come out maybe maybe 89. And so I started listening to it more, and it was this cool mix, and it was a really good fit for being in Panama, because there was this tropical mix to it, but it was relatable to someone that was both a fan of country music and a fan of different types of rock. And what was cool about it was really simple music. I could grab that guitar there and play still many of those different songs, because they weren't hard. Jimmy Buffett never made himself out to be a virtuoso guitarist. And they were relatable songs. They were stories, and it was storytelling, and it was almost an escapism. And especially once you're out somewhere and you're in Panama, stationed down there, and you're dealing with what you have to deal with on the being in the service side. Jimmy Buffett sang about this great place that was very relatable, that was very understandable, that was very desirable, a place that you really wanted to be. And so you start imagining, and you start getting those sorts of stories in your head, and again, he created that fictional place that you wanted to be, but it helps you deal with the real place that you're in. And so I took that, and then from Panama, I went to Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah. And I brought another of my guitars, and I brought one of my acoustic guitars from Texas, and I had all of those there in Savannah. And I remember one day we were on River Street, and there was this restaurant, this bar called Port Royale. And we went in there, we're sitting in there. I can remember this real tall, I think it was Brit, bartender. And there was a guy with an acoustic guitar and a drum machine. And he was just, he was playing some stuff. And I recognized some of it. And he played some Hank Jr., and he was playing some Jimmy Buffett. But he played this other song. I remember he played the song London Homesick Blues. And I remember I had a recording of Jerry Jeff Walker playing that. And I had a recording of David Allan Coe playing that. And then I asked him if he knew the song You Never Even Called Me By My Name. And he said that he knew the lyrics, but had never learned the chords. And I told him it's easy. It's this. It's like D, G, and C with an A minor thrown in. And he said, "Oh, you play it?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, play my guitar and I'll sing it. You play it." So we did that. So I played his guitar. I sang it. He asked me if I knew Grapefruit, Juicy Fruit, Jimmy Buffett. And I did. And so we did that one. And then he told me, he said, "Hey, next time you come, if you've got, bring your guitar down and we'll, and you can sit on it for a few songs." So I'm like, okay, it's cool. And so it started this, almost every weekend, if we weren't TDY somewhere while we were in Savannah stationed at Hunter, Friday night, Saturday night, sometimes even on a Thursday night, grab the guitar and go down there, sit in with, his name was Jimmy Hurricane, and play mostly a bunch of Jimmy Buffett songs. I learned so many more Jimmy Buffett songs from just sitting in and hanging out there with him. But we'd play some Hank Jr., we'd play some other things. And it was just and I remember Jan, the tall Brit bartender, he'd come and play bass sometimes. But again, it became in that time, sort of similar like when we were at the gazebo as a platoon in Panama, but it would give us this opportunity for the camaraderie side of our unit, go all out to River Street together, go to Port Royale, everyone kind of have fun. It's kind of fun, I guess with me up there, one of your buddies, one of your comrades and platoon members, getting to be up there and perform. It just created these good times that again, maybe there's an escapism piece to it. It's not that being at Hunter was hard, and none of these experiences that I connect music to my service with or anything like what the GWAT generation has gone through. But nevertheless, we all have our own individual experiences when we're in the service, and there's a soundtrack to those experiences. I mean, just like Business Flare has a soundtrack, my experience in the Army has a soundtrack. And in the description, I'm going to post the link to the playlist on Spotify and YouTube of my service soundtrack. And I'd encourage you, create your own. Tell us what your service soundtrack is. But I took all of that and then, I think the thing though is once you create these connections and these emotional connections to these places, and I'm not getting into war stories and deep into the individual things that were happening in these places, that I'm talking more about music and just where I was, but there's significant events that took place, and when you're doing and the music connects you to those places. And I think that one of the things that happens there though is once you're not in that place anymore, maybe it changes your relationship with that music. Because I don't listen to a lot of that music anymore. My musical tastes always evolved, and I'm a hard rock heavy metal guy at heart. But it's interesting. I didn't listen to as much of the hard rock and the heavy metal when I was in the service. And I think some of that may have had to do with the people that were around me and trying to find common ground, and not just force people to listen to stuff maybe they didn't like. And so I think I think there's an element of that. But I moved to Florida 2 years after I got out. And I love Key West, and I was drawn to Florida, and a song like, Jimmy Buffett's Migration is one of the songs that made me want to be here, because when I got out of the Army and I went back to Texas to finish school, I was still doing a lot of Buffett. I was still playing a lot of Jimmy Buffett on my acoustic, learning more of his songs, and there was an element of that fantasy land, of that placemaking desire that we talked about in episode 3. That was part of why I moved to Florida, but it wasn't the main reason. But there was consistency there, but then once I decided to stay here, that was a big part of it, especially in the first year when I was spending a lot of time practically living in Key West for part of that time. But then you realize that the Florida and even Key West is not the place in the songs. It's the place that inspired the songs. But when you get there, it's not. You don't find Margaritaville when you actually get to Key West. You find a store named Margaritaville. But I find that over time, I don't listen to Jimmy Buffett very often anymore. I don't listen to Hank Williams Jr. very often anymore. When I listen to classical, I don't listen to Dvořák that much anymore. Meatloaf now and then, but not like I did before. And so I think, and this is something I'd be interested in when we start talking with other vets, is, do we leave something behind with this music? Do we give up our relationship with this music, or do we lose our connection with this music when we lose our connection to that place, and to these places that we're so emotionally connected to? There's lots of things that happen both in training environments and in live mission environments, whether it was in Monterey or San Angelo or in Panama or in some places where we did temporary duty in TDY, or in Savannah. There are emotional connections that come out of all those places. And there are emotional connections to the music and to the music we had when we were there. And when we're not there anymore, what happens to that connection to the music that defined those times or defined those places for us? And I find that I don't so much have that. What I do have still is I have more connection to the music I listened to in high school, when I was first trying to become a musician. The things that were really the biggest influences on me as a musician, rather than the things that were an influence on me as a soldier. And so I don't know what the lessons are yet for what makes this important for our cities today and our placemaking today. I didn't view this as an episode that was going to answer that or solve it, but I see it as an episode that starts to ask the questions. And so as we take this forward, we're going to start reaching out and talking to veterans and understanding how they connect to place through music, both during their service and today. Good experiences or bad experiences. And I think it'd be especially interesting to talk to some veterans who work in the field of economic development and get their thoughts on how do we then take these lessons, what's hidden in there. The whole purpose of this podcast is to find your city story and find what's hidden in music that helps us make better places. What can we learn from military service, from theaters of combat, from war, from barracks life, from training environments? What can we take from the music that got us through that and bring that into our placemaking? Especially maybe as we deal with trying to improve places that are not in a good place right now. And how do we bring them out of that and bring them forward? Again, podcast at themusiccities.com if you're a veteran and you want to talk about your experiences with music and how music relates to place. Let us know, and would love to have a conversation with you and see how you fit in to coming on and chatting about it. Until next time, thanks for watching. Let's do it.